Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to the Bible in a Year 2021. And we are working on day 186, which involves 2 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 25. So as we set in on this in 2 Kings 14, verse 1, we see that there's a new king for Judah, Amaziah, the son of Judah's king Jehoash. So he became king in the second year of Israel's king, the Judah's king Jehoash, compared to Joash, who was Jehoiah's son. Yeah, that's quite a mouthful. And it's interesting that you go through this and you see how similar the names are with the Israeli king and Judah's king. Anyway, that's just an aside. So we discover here that he is a Yahweh worshiper. So in verses 3 and 4, he did what was right in the Lord's eyes, but not as well as his ancestor King David. So he didn't do it with all of his heart. They refer to like David's heart when they're looking at how, what his motivation is and the relationship he had. He did everything his father Jehoash did. However, the shrines weren't removed. Again, we mentioned that the shrines were used for the sacrifices. They didn't go into the temple to perform the sacrifices, but it was a rule from the beginning that they had to come and make their sacrifices at the place that the Lord designated. So people kept sacrificing and burning incense at them. In verse 7, we see that he gets a big victory here. So next, Amaziah struck down 10,000 Edomites in the Salt Valley and captured Selah in battle. He renamed it Joktheel, which is what it is still called today. Remember that El is indicator of God. Okay, not Yahweh, but God. And then, arrogance. Arrogance is always the downfall of kings. And we see in verse 8 here, he makes a bad move. Then Amaziah sent messengers to Israel's king Joash, son of Jehoahaz, son of Israel's king Jehu, saying, "Come on, let's go head to head." Not a good idea. And the king of Judah, of Israel, really tries to dissuade him. Even sends a little parable along, and just really tries to discourage him. But the king of Judah would not listen. And so what ends up happening is Judah was defeated by Israel and everyone ran home. At Beth Shemesh, Israel's king Joash captured Judah's king Amaziah, Jehoash's son and Ahaziah's son. Joash then marched to Jerusalem, broke down 600 feet of the Jerusalem wall from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate. Joash took all the gold and silver and all the objects he could find in the Lord's temple and the treasuries of the palace, along with some hostages, and returned to Samaria. And then we find that his fate ends up being just like his father's. And in verse 19, some people in Jerusalem plotted against him. When Amaziah fled to Lachish, they sent men after him to Lachish, and they murdered him there. So it follows this pattern that the kings of Judah have. They come in, just like what with Solomon. It was really Solomon probably who established this pattern. But they come in, they're young, they're kind of afraid of the responsibility. They don't know what to do. They lean heavily upon Yahweh. Yahweh gives them success. They take that success as being because they're strong or they're smart or they're rich, and they become arrogant. And then in that arrogance, they fail, and there's a downfall. And we're going to see it yet. And this is what really stands out in verse 21. Because remember that Yahweh said that he is the one who would decide who would become king. So then all the people of Judah took Azariah and made him king after his father, Amaziah. He was 16 years old. So 16 years old, he becomes king. Meanwhile, in Israel, we have King Jeroboam II. So Jeroboam, the son of Israel's king Joash, became king in Samaria in the 15th year of Judah's king Amaziah, Joash's son. He ruled for 41 years. That's pretty stable. That's a long time for a king of Israel. He did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. He didn't deviate from all the sins that Jeroboam, Nebat's son, had caused Israel to commit. So it keeps going back to Jeroboam. I told you it would. The condition of the kingdom would always fall back on being his fault, as it should. So in verse 25, we read a little more. He reestablished Israel's border from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea. So there's a bit of revival here. This was in agreement with the word that the Lord, the God of Israel, spoke through his servant, the prophet Jonah, Amitaiah's son, who was from Gath Hepher. So we're going to hear a little more about Jonah later, not today, but we're going to hear more on this prophet. So just pointing out here, Jonah was a prophet in Israel, and he was being used by the Lord there to deliver messages to the king. So there is some form of Yahweh worship going on, not the proper worship, but at least an acknowledgement of Yahweh. So then we switch gears. We go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 25, verse 2, and we're going to just read the rest of the story of Amaziah. We will read here some of the things that we didn't pick up in 2 Kings. So he did what was right in the Lord's eyes, but not with all his heart. That's what I was referring to when we're looking at 2 Kings. It wasn't with all his heart. And we see here he was pretty amazing. He really built up the military. Amaziah gathered the people of Judah, organizing them into family units under captains of thousands and hundreds for all Judah and Benjamin. He summoned everyone 20 years old and older and found that there were 300,000 select troops ready for service and able to handle spears and body-sized shields. Now that may sound like a lot, but like he's 3-4 generations removed from when there was an army of a million compared to 300,000, and you begin to realize that the Lord is beginning to diminish these kingdoms. And then there was this, he made a couple of mistakes. So one of the mistakes is that he hired 100,000 warriors from Israel for 100 kikars of silver. And when the prophet comes and tells him here, he says, but a man of God confronted him, King, he said, the troops from Israel must not go with you because the Lord isn't on the side of Israel or any Ephraimite. Should you go with them anyway, even if you fight fiercely, God will make you stumble before the enemy because God has the ability to either help or make someone stumble. So that's a pretty clear thing there for them. And he's got a decision to make. And he makes the right decision, but at the same time, he's asking, what about the money I paid for them? And the prophet says, don't worry about it. Like the Lord can provide you way more than what you're losing here. Those troops that are released are not happy. And they end up ransacking some of the villages and stuff because it's not just the money that they get paid for showing up. They also get a portion of the spoils of war. And so they feel they're missing out on that. So they attack villages on the way home. So then we see here in verses 14 and 15 where it all went wrong, because 2 Kings doesn't really give us this information. So here it says, when Amaziah returned after defeating the Edomites, he brought the gods of the people of Seir. He set them up as his own gods, bowed down before them, and burned incense to them. As a result, the Lord was angry with Amaziah and sent a prophet to him. Why do you seek the gods of this people? The prophet asked. Don't they couldn't even deliver their own people from you. Yeah, and that was like, it didn't even make sense. It wasn't even logical. And we find that time and again. he gets angry at the prophet, and that's when the arrogance comes upon him. Instead of humbling himself before the Lord, receiving that correction, no, he gets arrogant here. So and that's where we have here. So, since when do you give me advice? In verse 16, Amaziah interrupted, you better quit before you end up dead. So the prophet stopped, but not until he said, I know God's plans to destroy you because you've done this and because you refused to listen to my advice. So he didn't prevent Amaziah from going against Israel, and he knew it would be his downfall. And then we read that the conspiracy that was actually in place to assassinate him wasn't a result of him being defeated by Israel, but because he had turned away from the Lord. And so it was a long conspiracy, long in the making. So in verse 27, from the time Amaziah turned away from the Lord, some people conspired against him in Jerusalem. When Amaziah fled to Lachish, they sent men after him, and they murdered him in Lachish. So they couldn't try to assassinate him before he was defeated by Israel, because he was too strong. But the military is defeated, his bodyguard, everything is gone. The king of Israel left him basically with nothing. So he has nobody to protect him. And he hears about the conspiracy, tries to escape, and they follow and assassinate him. So the lesson of this is don't get big for your britches, too big for your britches. Remain humble and acknowledge that the Lord is the one who provides success, and continue in his ways, and you will continue to have success. So we're going to leave it there. You guys have a blessed and wonderful day, and thanks for joining, and we will meet again tomorrow. God bless.